Galathe must have did this beat.
So thank you guys for joining another episode of the Q Chat podcast. So I have another special guest. I always introduce my guests as special because they are. And this is Maya B. Galathe. She's a licensed professional counselor, and she owns Gold Digging Therapy. So as you can see on her shirt, as she says, therapy is a vibe. People that listen in on the show knows that I talk a lot about mental health, erasing stigmas, and also the beauty of therapy. So I'm so happy to have her on. So I want to give you the floor and let you introduce yourself. How are you doing today?
All right. I am well today. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I
No
also
problem.
appreciate you pronouncing my last name correctly. People
Okay.
usually butcher it. So thank
Oh,
you for
wow.
that. So yes, I am Maya B. Galathe. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm physically located in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but my private practice, which is Gold Digging Therapy, that's GOAL Digging Therapy. Um,
Okay.
I am virtual. So I'm licensed in the state of Louisiana, meaning that I can meet virtually with anyone in Louisiana who's interested in mental health therapy or counseling with me. I actually just started my practice this year, just became licensed this year. It's been a long journey, but I'm finally where I want to be. And so I'm really excited about it. And like you said, therapy is a vibe. That's kind of my tagline. And
Yes.
I just want people, my whole reason for getting into mental health, my whole reason for becoming licensed and opening up my own practice was to change the stigmas that surround mental health in Black communities. I
Mm.
want us, and there's a shift happening. There really is a shift happening with younger generations like millennials and Gen Z. Where there's all these memes we see about like, oh, wait till I tell my therapist this, or like, there's a lot out there. So I love to see it. It's funny, but at the same time, it's opening up a conversation, which hasn't happened in our past generations. They looked at therapy as something to be shameful about, something you don't talk about. Oh, we don't talk about our problems that are going on in the home. So I love the shift that is happening. And my whole goal, the whole reason I'm doing this is just to keep that shift going.
You hit a lot of points. I definitely feel, and I've said this a lot on the show, I feel like in the African American community, I mean, that's what we're conditioned. We're not supposed to discuss our business. You're not supposed to tell people anything that's going on. And I always try to be careful when I mention prayer and therapy. Because like I said, I'd never want to reduce the power of prayer. I'd never want to reduce that. However, I just feel like we are conditioned to, or at least I know in my experience, it's like, okay, if you're dealing with, if you, God forbid, you say you're depressed, number one. Well, what's wrong? You need to go pray on that. You need to go to church more. I'm not knocking that at all. I'm just saying people do have mental health conditions. There's things that needs to be treated professionally, is all I'm saying. So I don't want
Right.
anyone to be like, oh, well, she don't like prayer. She don't like Jesus. No, I'm not saying that. But yes, therapy is a necessity. Just talking about past trauma or being able to identify trauma, number one. I think that's something in our community that a lot of times we don't realize we're dealing with
Yes.
PTSD, or we don't realize, hey, that experience that took place when you were a child or a teenager, that actually is not the norm. That was a traumatic experience, but you were conditioned that it was okay and that you just move on and you just let it go. That term "let it go" is something that's like nails to a chalkboard for me,
Yeah.
because I've been told that a lot about certain things. Oh, just let that go. no, I can't let it go. Like, you have to speak about things. So it's just a breath of fresh air whenever I hear in our community, especially when I speak to therapists, where they're like, hey, it's okay to talk about it. And the fact that the stigma, I feel, is still there, but it's not as bad on some levels. I feel like we can talk about it now. Like, hey, oh yeah, I'm gonna go to therapy. I think that
Mm-hmm.
it's a slow build. People talk about
Right.
it way more. So I know when I was doing the research on you, you also said that your counseling private practice was specifically designed to meet the needs of young Black professionals, entrepreneurs, and business owners, and that you specialize in the areas of racial trauma and dealing with anxiety and depression brought on by life transitions. So obviously, 2020, the infamous 2020, we all went through some highs and lows. Beyond COVID, which I know personally I dealt with a lot of anxiety on a lot of issues, and COVID, I felt kind of triggered them.
Mm-hmm.
But besides that, obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement was thrown out there on a whole different level this year. Do you feel, and I mentioned this to a previous therapist I had on the show, do you just feel like African Americans in general, we deal with a lot of PTSD just with the racial trauma?
Mm-hmm.
How do you guys attack that, as far as mental health specialists, because I feel like we have a different, as African Americans, we're on a different level of trauma and anxiety. Just the
Mm-hmm.
racial tension alone causes a lot of stress.
Yeah, which is a great question. So let me answer that kind of two part.
Mm-hmm.
So my first part, I kind of want to go back to how you gave like that little introduction of what I specialize in, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
not just me putting that out there just to sound fancy or whatever you
Mm-hmm.
want to call it. What's very important with therapists, and this goes along with the shift that's happening just in mental health in general. I
Mm-hmm.
think a couple years ago, maybe as recent as let's say 3, 4, 5 years ago, a lot of therapists will get into the field and they're licensed, they're qualified, nothing, I'm not knocking them at all, but they would just work with anybody. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
work with this white 5-year-old girl who is struggling with defiance disorder. And I'm also going to work with this 50-year-old man who's having marital problems and this couple and this Black person. So not to say you can't help everybody, but if
Mm-hmm.
you have a focus, you have a specialty area, you're going to be more specialized. You're going to be better able to identify those issues, have the resources to help those issues, the language to talk to people about it. And that's why I am so specific in who I work with. I
Mm-hmm.
work with young Black professionals, entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call yourself, business people, because we are the ones who are experiencing all of this that's going on right now. I think with everything that's happening in 2020, it's hitting us a little harder because a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people in that age range, like millennial, Gen Z, your 20, 30-year olds, those are majority of the people who we see are losing jobs during this time. Because you have to think about the industries they're working in, right? People that are maybe working in the food industry to put themselves through college or grad school. Those are the people that are losing their jobs during this pandemic. Then we have to think about, like you said, the Black Lives Matter movement and who is on the forefront of that. When you're looking at the pictures and you're seeing the news, you're seeing a lot of young Black faces. That's who's leading
Mm-hmm.
this movement. So
Right.
everything that's going on that's hitting people, it's hitting the population I work with. And I, a lot of times when I say that, I say us, because I'm included in that. A lot of people that I work with,
Yeah.
we are the same age. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that adds a little advantage there too, because it's like, I understand. I
Yeah.
understand. Like I'm
Right.
experiencing it too, right? The difference is I have that training, I have that schooling to make it make sense to you and to help you. Um, and so to answer your question with do I, look at the trauma, the PTSD, there's actually a term out there and I always bring it up when I'm doing interviews. It
Mm-hmm.
was coined by a Black professor at the, I believe it's University of Utah. I'm sorry for not looking into it, but I believe he's at the University of Utah. His name is William Smith,
Mm-hmm.
and he has done a lot of research on something he coined, a term he came up with called racial battle fatigue. And the short of it is that being Black in America, is synonymous to being on a war zone, being in a war zone as a soldier. So that same mentality, when people are out there on the battlefield, they're fighting for their lives, literally, and then they come home and they're having these issues with readjusting, and they're having the nightmares. They're not eating, not sleeping, their thought processes are off. Being Black in America has the same effect on us. The difference is, a lot of times we do not realize it, because when you're a soldier, when you're on the battlefield, you see what you're fighting against. It's very apparent what's going on. PTSD is something we talk about all the time, so it's out there, it's prevalent, we know about it. Racial battle fatigue is not. We like to act like we live in a post-racial society, but we don't. We see it on the TV every day. Racism is still very real. It's there. America does not care about Black people, just like Kanye West said that time about George Bush. We laugh about it, but that's the picture that's being painted. But the difference between racial battle fatigue and PTSD is we try to sweep racism under the rug. Whereas for our veterans, right, we have all these resources, we have the VA, we have counselors that specialize in working with this population, but not so much for our Black people who are suffering and experiencing that same post-traumatic stress.
Right. And that's the thing. It's such a delicate subject, I feel, when you try to talk about race with people that just really don't get it. I mean, I know personally this year, when everything happened with George Floyd, I was just like, okay, Emmett Till, I was like, okay, as far as people that were just so shocked. And I was like, I had mixed emotions, because I was like, okay, do you guys really think that's the first incident? I'm like, you guys just had the pleasure of watching the whole thing. I'm like, I grew up seeing Eyes on the Prize as a very young child and seeing that mutilated young boy in the coffin. So I'm like, okay, like this, I was extremely numb to it. Okay. But I had people texting me, some former white coworkers, well, how are you feeling? I'm like, same way I feel 365 days a year, especially in the parish that I live in. I'm like, I've been trying to tell y'all this for the longest. So it's just like, but yeah, the stress was there only because it was a trigger. And then there were so many different emotions, because there's obviously people now that still didn't care. Oh, well, he was doing this, that still justifies us being treated like animals. So it brings you to so many different waves of emotions. But I know personally, because I have teenagers in the home, one in particular is a Black male, and just seeing his reaction to seeing a lot of these things, so for him, I know that was like a firsthand experience, and it hurt as a mother, number one, and then it added to stress. Because I remember years ago when I worked in a department with majority white people, and it was only me and another African American, we both had sons, and we were trying to explain to someone, it's different for us when our kids leave the house just to do regular activities. Like, we're nervous, we're sick over it, and that's a feeling that you really can't explain to people. So, I just feel like with African Americans, just it's healthy to speak about what's going on now, because there's so many waves of emotions, and it just kind of reminds us of certain things we can't control. And I just feel like a lot of us collectively as a whole were frustrated, because it's like, okay, we've been living with this for the longest. So I think a lot of people were just numb to it and just disgusted, angry. It's like so many levels, just like the 5 stages of grief, going through so many different levels of how everyone reacted to what was going on a racial level. But I think the conversation regarding the PTSD that we all experience with it, I think that wasn't really brought to the forefront. I think a lot of people didn't realize, like, hey, we are experiencing racial trauma. Number one, having to see all of this, seeing the people that didn't agree with it, it's a lot to absorb, and it's racial trauma. So I just think that's a conversation that definitely needs to be put out there, because I think a lot of us, we don't realize that we're dealing with actual trauma from this. And I know when everything kind of came out and everyone was being more vocal about their past racial experiences, I know I had friends who were posting on Facebook past racial incidents. I had one friend, and I'm in my 40s, and so is she. She posted something that happened when she was like 10 years old about being called the N-word for the first time. Like that's stuff
Mm-hmm.
that you don't
Mm-hmm.
forget. And I'm sure she didn't wake up every day thinking about this, but it was a trigger, and she went back to it. So it's, like I said, racial tension and trauma is something that I felt people definitely should speak about more. So, also with your platform, can we talk about how you mentioned meeting the needs of the Black professionals and entrepreneurs and business owners? So, how do you tie in mental health with those arenas?
Yes. So one of the biggest issues that um, I see a lot of people or they speak about or comment about is that work life balance. And it's a lot different. And that's something else. I mean, it's just the times are changing. So we're seeing a lot of different things. So we think about generations where women were getting married at, 15, 16, and they stayed home, they took care of kids, the man made the money, what have you. It's not like that anymore. Women are getting married later, and men, right? Because it takes it takes two. So we have our young people are getting married later, they're having children later. Some people are putting off kids altogether because we see a lot more building within themselves, whether that's building wealth, building for their future generations, or what have you. So with that comes new issues, trying to balance all of this. And we talked about everything that's going on in the world already. So you have all this going on in the world while trying to work on yourself and navigate a system that isn't designed for us to win. So you're
Mm.
gonna run into a lot of roadblocks, you're gonna run into a lot of no's on the way. And when you're hearing that and it's constantly happening, that stuff is going to impact your self-esteem, your self-worth, your self-value, whatever you want to call it. No matter how strong you are or how you were raised, everybody's gonna respond to it differently. But when you're in a world where you are wanting to build yourself, you're wanting to get to a higher level, whether that's through education or work, and you're going to hit the roadblocks. That's just inevitable. Somebody along the way is going to tell you no. Somewhere along the way, you're going to have that supervisor that you just don't get along with. You're going to have that toxic work environment, right? So
Mhm.
navigating all of those things is something that I help people do, along with how is this impacting your self-worth, how is this impacting your self-esteem, and what have you. On top of that, also when you're an entrepreneur or you're a young professional, you're trying to build something, you have to create that balance. You have to know when to turn off, right? So I have there's this thing, and I don't know if you're familiar with the term hustle culture. So
I've never heard of that.
hustle culture is, it's a fairly new thing. It's a social media thing, but I'm pretty sure you've seen, there's like those memes out there, or just people posting statuses of stuff where they're like, oh, grind every day, and I don't have time to sleep. Like, I gotta go get this money, and if you're not working every day, you're wasting your time. So that's hustle culture. I
Hmm.
hate hustle culture. I am anti hustle culture. And
Hmm.
that's something I talk about with my clients and on platforms and things like that. Stop letting the internet tell you that you can only survive off of 4 hours of sleep. That's not okay. You need to take care of yourself before anything else. You're only going to get so far if you're not taking care of yourself, number one. And number two, let's say you're one of those people that's just, grind, grind, grind 24/7. You're not eating right, you're not sleeping right, you're destroying all these relationships with people that you love because you're focused only on this one thing, which is great. by no means
Mhm.
am I saying don't build something, right? Because like I said,
Right,
I have my own private practice. I understand what it's like
right,
to be an
right.
entrepreneur, but I also understand the importance of self-care, the importance of taking a break, and
Mhm,
what is the point of, you know, grinding and digging yourself into the ground if you can't even enjoy the fruits of your labor.
mhm.
So hustle culture and just breaking that whole narrative of hustle culture is a big thing that I focus on.
That's a good point. I mean, I would say I'm an entrepreneur too. And the funny thing is, when I decided to leave the workforce last year, in 2019, and when I was working for an employer, I was like, and I worked in an environment where like they kind of rewarded you for being that workaholic, for, coming in on Saturdays and Sundays and
Mm.
doing that overtime. I remember one Christmas I felt was ruined because I had like 20 hours of overtime alone. And it would have been more than that if I had clocked in on some of those times. Like I was working 24/7. I kept saying to myself, I have got to leave. This is too much. Cause I was like, I was making decent money, but I was like, I'm stressed out. I'm thinking about
Mhm.
work at night. I'm waking up in the mornings thinking about, oh, who I should have called. I would dream about work. Like, I
Mhm.
swear to God, I would dream about my job.
Yep.
And I was like, I can't get away from this job. And so when I decided to work for myself, that was a whole different monster. Cause I even told one of my friends, I was like, wow, I was complaining with the other situation that I was working. Now I said I'm working 24/7 because I'm responsible for my pay. So I was like,
Mhm.
okay, I may have taken some wrong turns with this one because I was like, I enjoy building on my own, but I was like, I'm having a hard time work balance, like you mentioned. And I actually
Yeah.
had a past guest who talked about addiction. Now, even though he was struggling with a drug addiction, he was breaking down the different levels of addiction. And he also mentioned being a workaholic. So I'm interviewing this man and I'm listening like, okay, he pointed out some stuff about me. So I love how you mentioned, the work balance, because I think especially, like I said, I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs because I do promote a lot, basically saying, hey, if you're miserable at a job, maybe you need to rethink, because I'm just all about healthy living in general. And sometimes we don't realize that our jobs are literally killing us slowly, or they're
Mhm.
causing that mental stress, and we're holding on to stuff for no reason instead of moving on. I just have so much to say about that part. But with working for yourself, I think it's easy to kind of fall in that trap because you thinking, oh well, yeah, like you said, well, I worked all night, I didn't even sleep, I didn't even eat. Like you thinking that you did something great, but it's like, okay, you just basically depositing into a potential heart attack.
Mhm.
You're not going to enjoy any of the stuff that you're
Mhm.
trying to build. But I just think when people are trying to work for themselves, it's like you kind of have to talk yourself into that sometimes to remind yourself, like, hey, it's okay to take a break and it's okay to balance what you're working on. I think it's just so easy though when you're working for yourself to fall into it because most people, when they decided to obviously be an entrepreneur, is normally something that they enjoy, they love.
Mhm.
So I just think it's a slippery slope, but it's important to say, hey, I'm not going to do this 24/7 because it's really unhealthy. But I just
And I
think
think
sometimes we don't catch that.
yeah, and something else you said earlier, I can't remember exactly what you said, but it led me to say this point, and I think a lot of it too is social media and the internet glamorizes what entrepreneurship truly is.
Hmm.
So a lot of us just we get on there and it's like, oh, you get to work for yourself, you get to set your own hours, and you're gonna be rich, and oh, you can do what you want. And that's not what it is. It's not.
No, it's not.
It is. It's not. It's very glamorized from the outside looking in.
Hmm.
I would
Right.
suggest anyone who is an entrepreneur and thinking about being one to read this book called The E Myth. Or
Hmm.
I did the audio version, and the first two chapters, I haven't even gotten past the first two because I'm so focused on implementing those because
Hmm.
it really paints a picture of what it is. It talks about how you have to be the technician and the manager and this and that. You have to be all these different things where your personality might not fit into it. A lot of people look at entrepreneurship and they say, "Oh, I'm really good at whatever this skill is, whether it's art, whether it's speaking, whether it's therapy, whether it's, I don't personal training, whatever it is, you can be the best at your craft, but your craft is not the only part of your business. That's just one part of it. And your personality, everyone doesn't have the personality fit or the discipline to take on all those other parts, like the money managing and being you have to do everything. You have to do everything. So I think that's the first part. Is a lot of people get caught up in what it looks like or what they think it is, and they don't account for all the other parts of it. And then the second thing is, okay, now you're a one man show or a one woman show, and it's stressful. It takes a toll on you. And that's why I think it's very, very important for entrepreneurs to have a therapist. Just like you have a CPA or an accountant to look at the money side of things, and you have all these different people that you can implement. You might have a personal assistant to help with the, like the phone calls, the emails, the administrative type stuff. Get you a therapist to help make sure that you're going to keep it all together and that business is going to keep running. That should be. Oh, also, I found out recently that entrepreneurs can actually write off therapy as a business expense. So if you have your own therapist, you can write it off as a business expense. Now, of course, I'm not an accountant. I'm not a CPA. So you go get that right with your money person. But I did read something about that recently.
I'll have to keep that in mind because I've gone to therapy in the past, but the funny thing is when I was working for an employer, I kept saying, I need to go back to therapy for, a lot of personal reasons. But I was like, I don't have time. And the one I was going to a few years ago, he's way in New Orleans, and I had moved to the North. So I was like, I literally didn't have time because it was impossible. And then I was like, I don't want to start over with a new one. But this year, it's so funny. I didn't realize there was one locally where I live at in Slidell, African American one, because I personally wanted an African American therapist. I was like, and that's no diss to anybody else, but I personally needed to talk to a Black therapist. I'm sorry, because I'm extremely woke on top of that. So I was like, I don't think it would work if I got a white therapist. And I'm not knocking white therapists at all. I'm just saying I needed one that related to my experience.
It needs to be a good fit. That's all it is. It needs to be
I needed someone that I was 100% comfortable with. So I remember there was a Black male one out here that I had spoken to with some other situations. And I was like, oh, duh, just go to him. And it's like water, we're talking or whatever, and it's a comfort level. But I always say on this show in particular, I think if only people looked at therapy just like we looked at getting your teeth cleaned twice a year, getting your physical once a year, go to the therapist as a checkup. It's mental health. I think the term mental, I think unfortunately has just been trashed, because people think anything regarding mental health is with the term that I hate, crazy, and it's just, and I don't know if it's just us that does it, but I just think it's ridiculous. So people don't understand what mental health, physical health, dental health, it's all the same thing. You need to be mentally healthy, and I think people also don't realize different levels of mental health disorders. Anxiety, if you're nervous all the time. I used to have situations where I couldn't breathe because I was so stressed out. So I'd be like, I couldn't breathe. My arm would literally start to hurt. And it was anxiety. I don't think a lot of people even associate the fact that they deal with anxiety, or they just think, we're from the South. So, oh, girl, my nerves were so bad over that. Yeah, you're dealing with anxiety. Your nerves are bad because you deal with anxiety. You're not getting it treated. So it's like, we really shouldn't be like, oh, that had my nerves bad. You're dealing with anxiety, or you may be dealing with some type of PTSD, or, whatever, some past trauma. But it would be cool if we looked at therapy just like going to the dentist. Like I've said this, getting your teeth cleaned and just getting that physical, just talking to someone. Like I just talked to someone yesterday about a situation, and they mentioned therapy. Then they kept going back and forth with it. And I was like, well, you have the control of how often you see the therapist, right? I said, you can start off slow and say, hey, I just want to talk to that therapist once a month. So you don't have to see them weekly or bi-weekly. You can just start off monthly if that makes you comfortable. But I'm like, I wouldn't just not go because you saying, well, I'm like, you can also just go to that one session and see if it's for you or not. Because you may enjoy talking to that person, or you may say, hey, I want to go to another one, but just don't throw it out the water,
Right.
basically.
And a lot of counselors have consultations as well. So you can have like a 15-20 minute conversation of like, okay, let me feel this person out.
Right. Let me see if I vibe with them, because it's
Mm-hmm.
important. Because I feel like, obviously, your therapist, you're telling them a lot of stuff, and you have to be comfortable. And you also have to make sure that person receives what you're saying, that they understand. So that's why, me
Mm-hmm.
personally, I wanted that African American
Right.
therapist, because I needed someone that really understood certain things on my level. And one thing I will say for anyone that tunes in and they're like, they may be riding the fence on therapy. Me personally, when I mentioned certain things to my therapist that I had other people in my life try to gaslight me and tell me, oh, just let that go and blah, 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 just spray that away. When you say certain things to a therapist and they break it down that your intuition is correct, yeah, that's not normal, that's when it's like, that's why it's so important to speak to that unbiased third party who's trained, because they will break certain things down to you and they'll confirm certain things like, okay, this feeling that you have is validated. You have a right to be upset over this. I get where you're coming from. Not that I'm saying the therapist is just there to agree with everything you're saying, because that's not what
Right.
they do. But I feel like that's a trained person and they understand those triggers. They understand those barriers that you're having trouble dealing with, and they can help you navigate through it, is what I
Mm-hmm.
do try to explain to people. So,
Mm-hmm.
don't knock therapy, folks. So I want to actually, I want to go back on the whole subject of just the stigma of therapy with African Americans, because I just feel like it's, I feel like the conversation is getting more comfortable, but the
Mm-hmm.
stigma is still there,
Mm-hmm.
basically. So how did just in your field, how do you guys just go about trying to erase the stigma? Because I know I would think it's a regular battle just trying to get people to understand that therapy isn't taboo. It's just, how do
Mm-hmm.
you guys go through that just to make people understand that it's not anything to be taboo about, especially within our community?
Right. So I'll speak about my platform specifically, and I don't want it to come off as like a self promotion thing because it's not what I'm trying to do right now. But when you are in school, right? So when you're in school to be a counselor, they drive all these things into your head about basically this is how you should behave, be careful on social media, and you're always a counselor, like someone's always watching, because the way counseling works, you can only practice in whatever state you're licensed in. And when we're thinking about pre-COVID, right before we had Zoom, everything, a lot, it was physical. You would come to an office and see a person. So then you're narrowing it down anymore, even more, to where the people you're working with are probably in your city because they're only going to drive so far. So there's this whole thing of, watch how you're behaving. You might see your clients out at a bar, in a grocery store, blah blah blah. So it's all about like behavior, how you present yourself, right? And for a long time, I carried that with me. So I was afraid to do a lot of things. Like I would go out with my friends and constantly, watch over my shoulder. And I'm talking about, this was before I was even licensed. But
Mm.
I'm thinking long term, and I know at some point I want to have a private practice. I want to see my own clients. So just being very cautious with what I will post and what I'll put out there. And this year, there was a lot of things that happened with me personally this year, to where I became a lot more comfortable with myself and who I am. And it really pushed me into, okay, it's time for you to go into private practice. Now it's time for you to have this platform. And this platform should be reflective of who Maya is as a person. And
Mm.
that is why I work with young Black professionals and entrepreneurs. And that is why I'm so open about, like, I wear my therapy as a vibe little shirts everywhere. I wear them everywhere. I'm Every conversation I have with people, I try to incorporate mental health into it some way. And the way, me personally, right, I can only speak for myself, but my way of breaking that stigma and making people more comfortable with mental health is simply by being myself. And
Mm.
it's so many people. I recently made a business Instagram page, and I went back and added a lot of friends and people I know personally, and they're like, oh, you're a counselor? Oh, I didn't know it. Well, let me tell you about, and now they want to talk. that doors open, they want to have those conversations, or somebody like people were referring their kids and stuff. I was like, well, that's not who I work with. Or and then there's like ethics on like I can't work with people that I'm friends with. But it was just so refreshing to see that. And I think it was because they felt comfortable with me already by me just being myself. So I think if we break down like that, because there's that thing in Black communities too, right? Where it's like, oh, she got all those degrees. She thinks she too much. Like that's part of a stigma in Black communities. But I think by being yourself and breaking it down and just being genuine with people and authentic with people, they're like, oh, okay, well, I feel comfortable talking to you as a person, then yeah, I'll come see you as a therapist. And so I know that was the big thing for me, is having to let go of all that stuff I learned in school, all that stuff they just drove into your head. And just I had to let that go and just be me. I had to make my platform, I had to make my therapy look like me. And it's going to attract people who look like me and who are like me. And that's the people that I work with.
And I think it helps. That's why I think Black therapists they're definitely essential, because in this field, when someone takes a step to speak to a therapist, because some people, they're more comfortable saying, hey, I'm going to talk to a therapist. Some people, they went through a long journey to finally say, hey, I'm going to go. And some people, when they start therapy, some people are comfortable with the idea of it, and some people aren't. Like something has obviously driven them to speak to one, but some people go into it, they're nervous, they don't know what to think. They maybe even be uncomfortable because it's like, okay, it's totally fresh, territories, but they took a step to go. So that's why it is important to have someone that you feel looks like you. And I don't mean obviously looks your twin, but no, meaning looks like you. They've been through the same experience. Just a feel, like you said, a vibe. Literally, like it is a vibe. It really is, and I just feel therapy is a mature thing too. I'm sorry, just for people that listen. Like I think somebody wrote to us one time, therapy is sexy. It is. It's like I want people to just look at therapy like therapy is sexy. It's mature. It's a vibe. Like it's great. Like it really feels good, because our mental health is something that we can't technically look at in a mirror. There's a lot of things that tell us that we're not healthy mentally, but I think sometimes we can't recognize it. So that's why I just really wish people would just view their mental health as extremely important. It's one of them things that is one of the most important things, I feel, because like if my legs hurt and I can associate that pain, oh God, I'm in pain, let me go to the doctor. But your mental health, you may not realize, okay, maybe this is why I'm a little agitated. This is why maybe I've been snapping at people recently. Or this is why maybe I'm sleeping too much or sleeping too little. I feel like we get these, little reminders that are reflecting on our mental health. But sometimes we may not realize that certain physical things that are taking place is associated with our mental health. It's PTSD or stress. Maybe this is why you're experiencing a lot of headaches. Maybe this is why, like I mentioned previously, there were certain incidences with my anxiety where I had trouble breathing. And like I said, I have asthma, but trust me, it wasn't asthma. This was like, I was feeling like I was having a panic attack, So I feel like our body also gives us little signals, but sometimes, everyone's on different levels. Sometimes some of us don't associate it that it goes up to here, like this is why your body's physically reacting. So I just really wish people would just be like, if only they got it. Like therapy really, it's a cool thing. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're experiencing some heavy things that you need to discuss, I feel like, so I will say this. I know with my therapy, there was something I needed to talk about, some stuff that took place in the past. So at one point I was like, okay, maybe we should not do it every week. Well, I was like, okay, I'm going to be more thoughtful on when I schedule it. Because sometimes I was like, I don't necessarily feel like talking about this particular subject in therapy today, but my therapist already obviously was aware of certain things, but a credit to him, he still, like, we don't just talk about certain triggering things the entire 60 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, he mixes it up, because it can get kind of stressful, but that's
Mm-hmm.
why, like you said, have that consultation with someone, make sure you vibe with them, because your therapist also knows you once you have that good relationship. So they'll know too, okay, this is how I'm going to segue into addressing this, with my clients so they're comfortable, So it's like I said, therapy is a great thing. I just hope people get more comfortable with it. So one of the last things I want to talk about, and I know you mentioned self-love, obviously with my platform, I talk about go love yourself 24/7. So anyone that like follows me on IG or whatever, that's all I talk about is self-love too. So how do you tie in self-love and therapy in mental health? How do you tie that in together?
First, by taking people that even take that first step of reaching out, I congratulate. It is like I'm throwing a party for you over the phone or through email, because that first step alone shows how much you love yourself. The fact that you're so in tune to yourself to realize, okay, something is not right and I want to do something about it. Is there a greater form of self-love, just to recognize something in yourself and want to do better and want to make a change is one of the highest forms of self-love. But whatever the issue is that a person's coming in for, it doesn't matter. It affects you in some way. So there's going to be talks about self-esteem and value. Boundaries is a word that comes up a lot lately. So enforcing your boundaries is a big form of self-love, and showing that you're advocating for yourself as well. So I think just the act of participating in therapy, and then just and even if it's not just having a therapist, right, but just doing things for yourself to care for your mental health. So whether that's practicing self-care by working out, by eating right, by watching a movie or binging a show for 4 hours at a time because you feel like you need to relax, just practicing different forms of self-care and doing things for yourself so that you feel replenished, so that you feel like I'm ready for the next day, that you feel like yourself is showing yourself some self-love.
I just feel like self-love, it ties to everything. I say this a lot. Like, when you truly value yourself, you will be more in tune with, okay, let me make sure I'm mentally healthy. Let me make sure I'm physically healthy. Let me make sure, I'm following certain goals. Let me make sure I have proper boundaries. Boundaries is something that we've been talking about recently. I think a lot of people kind of downplay boundaries. Boundaries will make or break your day, your life, your relationships, everything. Boundaries are so important, and boundaries tie into self-love, and it ties into mental health too, because sometimes we're so put upon because we don't know how to say no. Or even with self-love and self-worth and just understanding proper mental boundaries, saying no should not be offensive. If it offends a person, oh well, maybe you need to snip or something, but saying no is essential. Okay.
And it's a part of self-love. It is. It's a part of self-love.
Self-love, because sometimes we put ourselves out there, we're draining ourselves, we're stressing ourselves out over situations where all we had to say was no.
And going back to our conversation about entrepreneurship, that means saying no to yourself too. That means putting down the computer. That means shutting off the phone or whatever it is, telling yourself no, setting boundaries with yourself. So that you make that time to, again, enjoy the fruits of your labor, to take a little break, take a breather. If you don't answer one email for one day, it's not the end of the world. If you don't answer 10 emails in one day, it's not the end of the world. Just pick back up tomorrow.
Right. And another thing with entrepreneurship and saying no, I've had situations where I said no to certain opportunities because I was like, you know what? it's not worth the stress.
Mm.
Like,
And that's a
and
whole nother conversation. Like if it's,
right.
I think a lot of, especially when you're first starting out as an entrepreneur, you want to jump on every opportunity, you want to
Yeah.
get your name out there. But if something doesn't align with your values and with who you are as a person, I say all the time, all money ain't good money.
It's not. And I'm glad you touched on when you're first starting out, because I know when I first started out last year, things were different. I felt like I had to be like a people pleaser. If someone asked me to
Mm-hmm.
do something, oh, like you said, oh, I need to put my name out there. Let me say yes. And finally, when I started to realize after I said yes about certain things that I had a feeling about, but I was like, oh, I'm just gonna still do it. Then I was like, that was worth, that was not worth any of the stress or the headache. Now I'm so quick to say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, no, I'm not. Or same thing,
Mm-hmm.
certain things really don't align with what I'm personally trying to do. And I also had to learn to not give a damn, quite frankly, who didn't like me just simply
Right.
saying no in the nicest way possible. It's like, okay, if you don't like the fact that I said no, okay, that's between you and whoever. I
Yeah.
don't matter to me. It's like, and that's another thing I think with being strong mentally too, because
Mm-hmm.
when we get in that people pleasing thing, sometimes when people don't receive our no or I'm sorry, that also lead to like, oh my God, like, oh no, like they didn't like what I said, and then you get no, like keep it moving. Like just get that strength within yourself mentally too, to kind of, because sometimes we have to develop a thick skin over certain things, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not anything that happens overnight either. Not everyone's going to
Right,
like us, not
right.
everyone's going to receive us, not everyone's going to accept a simple no, but I feel like that also ties into self-worth and mental health, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you also have to realize certain things, certain reactions from people is not about you, it's more about them.
Oh yeah, it's
And
them.
right.
Ninety
And that's
percent of the
something
time,
that
it's
didn't,
them. Yeah.
right. And that wasn't something, for me personally, that wasn't something that I just got to overnight. Like it was a process for me to realize, okay, like you don't really have to take to heart how this person reacted. That's about them. Maybe they
Mm-hmm.
were having a bad day, or maybe that's just how they receive things. Okay, but don't let it get to you, So that's something that also just takes certain levels of growth. And I tie that to mental health and therapy too. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like once you start speaking to a counselor, whatever that person is, whether they're a licensed doctor, whatever, it gets you to a particular level of growth in your life too. Cause I just feel like you handle certain things differently. I know there's been a lot of things recently that I'm like, I've literally said to myself, the old me would have did blah, blah, blah. But I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
the new me is in like a whole different space. I ignore a lot now. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
like, a lot of
Boundaries.
stuff that I would have
Boundaries.
reacted to. I just
Mm-hmm.
feel like you get to a particular level when you start discussing things and you realize, like we just said, like certain things really have nothing to do with you. It's about other people. It helps you react to things totally
Mm-hmm.
different too.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like you just get to the point where it's like, okay, you just move on and you
Right.
realize certain battles are not worth it. And that's something
Right.
I felt like therapy helped to, just with ways I reacted to things, because it was just like,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't worth my energy to respond. Literally, I'm big on telling people protect your energy, and your energy is fragile. So it's like anything that you take time to put any time towards or any words towards, like you're literally taking a portion of your energy, and you should decide wisely. Is this worth a portion of my energy or is it not? Because a lot of times it's probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Like you drained yourself over absolutely nothing. So to round out the show, as you know, with Go Queen, I do ask everyone at the end, how do you define a queen? But with this one, it's slightly different because I feel like we are talking about something that is really huge and extremely important. Mental health, just being healthy mentally is just a big thing. And like I said, this particular episode will be published right before the very last episode of 2020. So I felt it was a perfect ending for the Q chat for this entire year, because that is one of my platforms to my heart, is mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I want to ask you how you define a queen, but can you kind of like tie it into like a mentally healthy queen? How do you find a queen that's mentally healthy? She's in her
Mm-hmm.
zen mode and she's vibing
Mm-hmm.
out. How do you define that mentally healthy queen?
Right. So everything you said right before you ask the question is a big part of that. So I'm talking about knowing what to give your energy to, knowing how to choose your battles, like you said, is a big part of being a queen. You have to know who, what, and when is worth your time. Does this serve me? How does it serve me? But then also, how am I serving myself and how am I serving others? I think would be the three parts of being a queen. So things that are serving you, and kind of evaluating and recognizing that ability to know how things are serving you and when it's time to walk away from things, when it's time to let things go, and doing it gracefully, and knowing how to serve yourself. So again, practicing good self-care, whatever that looks like for you, setting boundaries, whatever that looks like for you, and then serving others. So just knowing your purpose in this world. Once you know your purpose, it makes everything else a lot easier. So looking into yourself and knowing, what am I here for? What purpose? What is my purpose? What do I want to give to the world? Asking yourself that. And once you know that answer, and it truly, you believe it, everything else kind of starts to align, and it makes it a little easier to say no to things that don't serve your purpose. It makes it easier to walk away from those people who aren't in alignment with your purpose. It makes it easier to unplug from the world and pour into yourself, because you know that this is bigger than me and I have a purpose to serve.
I love it. I love it. I love it. You touched on so many things that I talk about purpose and what serves you. So that was amazing. So I want to thank you again for being on the show. But before we end everything, give everyone your social media handles where they can find you if they're interested in reaching out to you for therapy. Maya B. Galathe, gold digging therapy. Go ahead and tell everyone how they can find you.
All right. So pretty much everything's on my website, mayabgalathe.com. So that's MAYAB, my middle initial, and GALATHE.com. On there, you can find all the services I provide. I have a little store on there. So if you're interested in a therapy as a vibe shirt, I have them on there. I have face masks, everything. You can set a consultation with me on my website as well. And then there's also a link to some different videos I have on YouTube, as well as to my Instagram account.
Awesome. Thank you again. Like I said, this is just a very important topic, and we'll definitely have to have you back on, because I feel like there's so many other things
I know
we can tie into and talk about this, because mental health really is the core of how everyone can just be happy, just live a freer life. I talk about it a lot. So everyone that's listening, just rounding everything out, I just hope everyone takes in the things that we discussed, and just to know that you don't have to be ashamed of needing help. And needing help is not a level of weakness. There's nothing wrong with you at all, So that's another thing. If you seek therapy, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. If you feel like you're struggling, there is nothing wrong with you. There's nothing to be ashamed of. This is to make yourself healthy. Just as if your tooth was hurting, you would go to the dentist. If you're having trouble with your stomach or your head, you would go to your physical doctor. It's all the same thing. If your car was making a funny noise, you would take your car to the mechanic. So it's all relative. Therapy truly is a vibe. Being healthy is a vibe. Being mentally healthy is sexy, people. Okay. It's nothing more attractive than someone who is mentally healthy. Okay. And that understands boundaries, understands their purpose, what serves them and what they serve others. So I do hope that everyone that listens, that they took in some important points to this. And once again, if you guys are interested, I will make sure I have all of Maya's information when we do publish this on YouTube and on all the audio streaming platforms. But make sure you guys go love yourself. And one portion of loving yourself is to value your mental health. So thank you guys for joining the Q Chat. This will be the second to last episode. This is my last episode with the guest, actually, of 2020. So I'm very thrilled that you were on this special episode. I really appreciate you. And thank you guys for listening. And thank you guys for joining the Q Chat.